I'm joined today by a guest whose work embodies everything this podcast is about. Anne Byrn is a nationally best-selling cookbook author, food writer, and someone I would consider a culinary historian. Her latest work, Baking in the American South, is a masterpiece of food writing. With hundreds of recipes, it is part history, part memoir, part love letter to the flavors and families who shaped Southern baking. In this episode, Anne and I talk about the research behind the book, those who have preserved baking traditions for generations, the ways food becomes part of who we are. Her writing and this conversation remind us that recipes don't just feed us, they tell us where we've been and who we belong to. So, whether you are here for the biscuits, the history, or a good story, you're in for a treat. Let's dive in. Welcome to Grandma's Silver, where tradition meets today. I'm Allie, your host of the Grandma Silver podcast and founder of the Grand Millennial Lifestyle. Here, we blend aesthetics with nostalgia, engaging in conversations with lifestyle brands, designers, and more to rediscover the timeless charm of the past. Join me as we journey from home to heart, illuminating the past and polishing the present with the gleam of Grandma Silver. Well, thanks for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk with you in general, but of course, the conversation is always a little more exciting when we're talking about dessert. So it'll be,
Definitely.
I think, a lot of fun. Could you go ahead and tell people who you are and a little bit of your background and what you do?
Right. So my name is Anne Byrn. I am a native of Nashville, Tennessee, which is where I live. I have been writing about food for more than 4 decades. I got my start in Atlanta, where I was the food editor for the Journal Constitution newspapers right out of college. And that's really where my career began because I was interviewing people. Atlanta was a busy place. So not only was I interviewing people coming into Atlanta and the growth of Atlanta, but also I was interviewing sort of just average people in the countryside in Georgia talking about peach preserves or Vidalia onions. It was really a wonderful time. I also studied cooking in Paris. I took a leave of absence to go to La Varenne, École de Cuisine in Paris, because I felt like I needed it. And then I have been living back in my hometown for about 30 years. And I write cookbooks. I write a Substack newsletter called Between the Layers. I do some freelancing for Southern Living and other publications. So I'm very fortunate to have had a life writing about food. It's sort of evolved along with me.
Do you consider yourself at all a food historian?
Not from the standpoint that, I have a history major, but I definitely have settled into this niche in the last 3 or 4 books that I've written, where part of the story is the backstory, is the history. And as you know, from my background as being a newspaper reporter, I'm used to researching a subject, so it came quite naturally to me. And I guess I find it fascinating. So I love the story behind the recipe, and I guess there is history sprinkled in. So
Yeah.
I'll take it. Yeah.
I know that you kind of launched into this, you said, with your journalism career.
Hmm.
Surely there was some interest before all of that that kind of launched you into doing this as a career. I mean, was food part of your upbringing?
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a typical family. I believe that food is always good and it's on the table. And while you're having one meal, you're talking about the next meal and what it's going to be. And my mother was the fifth of 5 daughters. So she was never taught to cook, but she was self-taught, and she became the best cook of her sisters. And so we grew up. She was a very creative person. She arranged flowers. She had a lot of friends. So we grew up in that kind of household where food was fun. She let us cook. My sisters and I, 2 sisters and I, cook in the kitchen late at night as long as we cleaned up. We had friends over. So to me, food was really joyous and delicious. And making something myself, I think as a teenager, starting to bake and cook, it was very rewarding. People, said good things about it and gave me nice compliments. So that's my upbringing. And I've learned that I'm fortunate. I think that a lot of people's background is not the same as mine. And I never had to worry about food insecurity. I
Mhm.
didn't have to worry about violence in the home. I didn't have to worry about immigrant parents who were uncomfortable making the foods of their homeland. So
Mhm.
I think that writing about these topics today takes on a special meaning for me because I have to be upfront and straight and say, this is the way I was raised. And not everybody's raised this way. But food is a connector, and I believe it really connects all of us.
We'll certainly touch on that later. How did you decide to approach your cookbooks and your writing from kind of a storytelling angle? Because
Hmm.
you're talking about a recipe, you're sharing a recipe, but it's, no pun intended, quite layered.
It is very layered. That does go back to the stories that I wrote for newspapers because they were all stories. They had a beginning, which was called the lead. They sort of laid out the events, and then they connected it at the end, which is more of a magazine style. Whereas newspapers, you just sort of get someone interested, you keep writing it, and it's something you realize that your editor is going to cut the heck out of it at various places. So there's no sense in putting a lot of time into an ending because it's going to be cut. And that's kind of that storytelling, I really believe started with me writing feature stories for them, about food. And then when I did my first, big cookbook was The Cake Mix Doctor. For most people thought, well, that was just recipes. It's just 100 recipes, 150. But each recipe has a head note. And in the head note, I was able to tell the story of that particular recipe very succinctly. Whose was it? Where did I find this recipe? What makes it interesting? What does it taste like? And you can really cover all that in a paragraph pretty easily. And that's what I found that sort of the fun of writing head notes in cookbooks. And then as the type of cookbook that I wrote changed through the years, and I wrote American Cake, American Cookie, Skillet Love, and now Baking in the American South, um, there's more space given to the story. I mean, there's more emphasis on the story. Some of these recipes, you might say, well, a biscuit recipe is a biscuit recipe. True, but there's probably some little nuance, some difference in it. And really, who is this person who makes the biscuit and where do they get the wheat and why do they make it this way? Everything has a story.
I feel like a biscuit recipe is never just a biscuit recipe. That's
That's
one
true.
that I
That's
hear a lot of conversation about.
true. And years of practice go into it too, right?
Oh, that's funny. Well, today we are, as the weather warms, going to start talking a little bit about summertime desserts, which is really
Mhm.
exciting. Any season has its nostalgic desserts or, elements to it, but summer in particular, I think, kind of harkens that and evokes those feelings. Why do you think that summer is such an iconic time for all of that?
Everything's being harvested and is in season, and we don't get the fresh peaches but once a year,
That's very
and
true.
they come in the beginning of June, and depending on where you live. So peaches are summer to a lot of people. The same could be said for blueberries if you live in Maine, and blackberries if you live in Kentucky and Alabama. And people remember picking them wild, and they grow wild in our yard. So I think the summer is very evocative of memory, and it's sort of those foods of memory. And that's where I think we want to repeat the same type of recipe every year. You may want to make ice cream from the peaches. You're going to make pound cake to go with the peaches. You're going to make a cobbler, a crisp, or a crumble for those berries because that's what everybody expects, and that's summer.
Things that we might consider quote unquote retro that we're kind of seeing come back a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps it's just that there's more mediums for us to share them. Maybe they never really went anywhere.
A grandmother's icebox pie or icebox cake, you may have forgotten about it. You may have sort of shelved it over here because you've been trying all these new recipes. But maybe then you go to a family reunion or a gathering of family and you remember. You remember how delicious it was. And so maybe you start making it yourself. I think it's natural for us to always want to create our own recipes, our own style. I know I certainly did and didn't want to make the recipes of my mother's when I was in my 20s and 30s. And I'd say probably when I hit 45, I was interested in family recipes more than I had. And I wanted to make the ice cream, the peach ice cream, like her friend Azalee made the ice cream. I'm glad that I asked her those questions on how you do it. And I'm glad she wrote down little recipes in a recipe box in the kitchen. And she named her friend in the top right corner of the card who gave her the recipe. And it's in her handwriting because my mother's gone. And I think that that is a great gift I have from her. Nostalgia is all around us, but I do think it's up to us to decide when we want it back in our life.
I really do love that. You've obviously written quite a bit. Your most recent was Baking in the American South, if I'm not mistaken. Was that within the last year?
That was last Labor Day, September 24.
Okay. The impetus for that, there, like you said, there's lots of storytelling. There was a lot more space for that. That was really a big part of this book. How do you, especially because you've had several cookbooks at this point, what's your process look like for not only deciding perhaps what subject matter to cover, but for narrowing down or even selecting or figuring out which recipes you want to include?
That's where the subjective element of cookbook writing comes in, because your book on Southern baking would be different than my book. A lot of it is personal choice, I think. I certainly tried to keep my family recipes out of this book as much as possible, but 3 or 4 crept in because I knew they were fabulous. You know, I knew that my Aunt Elizabeth's banana pudding is so fabulous with a big meringue on top. But I really did try to be open-minded and grow, because I didn't know about Louisiana strawberries, for example. I didn't know how cantaloupes can and have been used in pie making in the South in the middle of summer, because they get really, really ripe and there's only so many you can eat for breakfast. So it was an old railroad recipe that I thought was fascinating, how the cooks were able to scoop out that really ripe melon and mash it and make a custard of it, and then pour it into a pie shell, put a big old meringue on top, and it was a cantaloupe. And the title for that recipe was called Half Gone. I love that. Half Gone Cantaloupe Pie, because the melons were so ripe, they were half gone. And that was a phrase for them, that they were overripe. I go into a project maybe with a list of recipes that I know kind of need to be in the project. Where they come from, that's the mystery. But then I also leave open the surprises, like the cantaloupe pie and like the strawberry icebox pie from Louisiana. Just so many different things that in my book that I wasn't raised on, but somebody was. And so how can I tell that story, and how can they all be collectively a part of this book?
The cantaloupe, the strawberries that you just mentioned, were you looking at it from place-based and being inclusive of place-based? Were you looking at ingredients?
All of it.
Okay.
I mean, it was complicated. It was like managing a big family because I had 14 states to keep happy. I set out saying I was going to write about the past as well as the present. I certainly had home cooks as well as pastry chefs and restaurateurs, men, women, Black, white, other cultures. And then these lists of recipes that needed to be in the book, plus the chapters need to be somewhat well distributed. I mean, I did have most of the recipes were pies and cakes. So those had to be really whittled down. But I needed to make it balanced. And I think that's the tricky part, is to come into a project. I wanted to be the reporter. I wanted to be the researcher, and I'm presenting this view of the South. So I needed to be balanced. If you're doing this book and it's, Allie's baking book, I mean, you can put in it whatever you want. I mean, you may find that you only bake cakes. And so you don't make that many puddings. And so there's no pudding chapter. So you have authors have a lot of license when it comes to writing a book, but you need to know your market. You need to know what you've promised the publisher you are going to deliver. And then you need to be proud of it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my background is anthropology. Early background is anthropology. So I have a lot of curiosity myself, and I love the history and story of just about anything. I would love to hear a little bit more about that research process. I mean, even when you're saying you have to keep 14 states happy, talking about an entire state is still quite vast.
But you can find sources in those states, which is what I did. And I love that that's your background because I think the social history is such a big part of cooking and baking
Hmm.
wherever you live. It's all about that. I just tried to find for every state a good half dozen really credible sources. These are people who've written about food for a long time, or maybe they were a caterer or owned restaurants. They were my sources. And I went to them saying, all right, what do I need to include? If I'm writing a baking book and I'm including the state of Texas, what has to be in here? And that was pretty much the question I would ask out of the gate to everybody. What do I have to include? Because I think we do know what recipes need to be that are from our area. And there was a lot of overlap. Everybody said cornbread. Everybody said cornbread. So cornbread was the first chapter in the book. And then those people told me about other people, people who had written authors, who had written small books, little micro areas of their state, regional differences. That was really, really interesting. And that was across the board. There were all kinds of regional differences because different people had settled in different areas of the state. Plus, agriculturally, certain crops would grow here, but not there. And that was fascinating. So then I had a map of the South and I was drawing circles around it. And I found this cake belt sort of in southeastern Alabama, southwestern Georgia, because those cakes, the caramel cake, the Lane cake, the Japanese fruit cake, they were all repeated over and over and over. It didn't matter if you were in Georgia or Alabama, but you were in that southern quadrant of the state, which I thought was fascinating. And then if you look at then do your history on how sugar came into the South and where it was grown, when it was not available, and why recipes then started to include molasses or sorghum and other ways of sweetening, maple syrup. It did take on just sort of a life all of its own.
Well, first of all, cake belt might be my new favorite map term.
Cake belt,
The
that's right.
cake belt. Is going off of that, because of course, some of these, not just regional differences, but even tying into it, maybe cultural differences. Were you able to have conversations with folks about some of those stories? And I have to imagine that's part of the research.
Oh, every recipe involved, interviews, definitely.
Okay.
If not with the person, then with the curator of the exhibit or the niece or whoever it was who remembered that person. I mean, I traveled to Mississippi to make this chocolate meringue pie in a very hot Mississippi kitchen, which is where this woman once made that pie. And the family had kept her bowl and the fork she used to stir together the ingredients. And I don't think they've replaced the oven in 50 years either. It was pretty old. But that was an amazing experience. And I think it just on and on. Every recipe required research. If it wasn't about the person, it was about the ingredient that was used in it. And every recipe to me had to say something about the culture of the South. It wasn't just a chocolate sheet cake, but what was in the sheet cake and who brought the recipe and why was it baked and when did people start baking it? Because that tells you a lot, like what size pans people use, and that tells you how many people they feed, right? You start baking in a 9 by 13 sheet pan, you're feeding people.
Mhm.
It's not just the little layer cake, little 8-inch pan. It's bigger. So there's access to ingredients, affordability, gatherings, community, church. So it was fascinating, really.
Yeah. Oh, how neat. Well, kind of going off of that, you touched on the oven, this woman's baking supplies, that kind of a
Mm-hmm.
thing. One of the things I was curious about is how you're balancing the authenticity of a vintage recipe, if we were to
Mm-hmm.
call it a vintage recipe, with modern Modern culinary practice, modern kitchens. What do you have a process for kind of adapting and keeping things genuine while making it make sense for today's bakers?
Yes, definitely. I will say in the head note that, Maggie used a fork to blend the mixture together. When the photograph, we show um, Lee making the filling with the fork, and then I will write that into the recipe, but I might say a fork or a whisk, blend it together. You're more likely to use a little whisk today. Gosh, there's back to that cantaloupe pie. For us to be able to, for me to be able to write that recipe so that you could make it and I could make it and anybody could make it, no matter where they live, no matter where cantaloupes were in season, we had to figure out a way to mash that cantaloupe. And I don't know if you've ever bought a melon and it's not ripe, it's
They're
not
not
mashing.
particularly mashable.
Right. So how can we do that? So we found by cubing the cantaloupe, putting it in a microwave, softened it, and then we could mash it and really strain out the juice, which is what we wanted in the first place. So we tried that recipe with cantaloupe at varying degrees of ripeness, and they all worked. Of course, the flavor was better in the most ripe cantaloupe, but it still worked. So I think that's something that a writer can do with an old vintage recipe is to make it as close to the original as possible first, and then troubleshoot it so that you can simplify that recipe for today's cook.
That's brilliant. And what a fun, I mean, how long does that take you to recipe test?
It takes a long time, and it's a different part of your brain than writing.
Oh,
It's
very much.
very scientific. It's creative, but it's also scientific. I would schedule writing days and baking days.
That's funny. I wouldn't have thought about the brain, but as you say it, that is very different. Not that this is fiction, but the pantser, the plotter, that whole back and forth about how people write. Yours is fact based, so I'm sure that's a little bit different.
It
But
it is. It veers into fiction, believe me, sometime when you run across the right story. Yeah, it is. It's fact based, which can just make you crazy at times. But we have so many resources today to dive into history, family recipes, etc. I mean, archives that are in libraries, and there's just so much out there. And I list all of those. I mean, I think, and I encourage people to go through your own old recipes and try to bring them back to life.
well, you touched earlier on this concept of connection with food, and I'd love to
Mm-hmm.
revisit that, especially understanding that all of these recipes do have stories behind them. All of the interviews that you had to
Mm-hmm.
conduct, I'm sure, are related to people, not just food. Do you have any examples of anything perhaps new that you learned, perhaps surprising that you learned about connection and heritage and culture?
Wow. Wow. I knew food was a connector, and absolutely food is a connector. I learned from book tour how much people love reminiscing about an old recipe. I worried writing this book that I was going to leave out some favorite recipe or something, but that really wasn't the case on tour. I felt like people were very supportive of everything I included, and they wanted to then share maybe a recipe and ask me if I'd heard of it. So I love that. But one thing maybe I had not thought about was how certain towns in the South, and I'm sure this is true of other parts of the country as well, are university towns. And university towns are different. They've always been different because they have the visiting professors, the tenured professors, and you have a lot of graduates who stay in that town. They don't want to leave town. And so it's interesting. The food scene is always vibrant, always good in a university town, very multicultural. And that really kind of came home with a flan recipe that was in the book because it was shared with me by a family whose mother was teaching at a university level in Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, all across the South. And she taught all of these languages. But she had a family of, she was half Brazilian, and she always, no matter where she lived and who she had dinner with, she always brought flan. That was her recipe that sort of introduced her to this new culture whether it was in Martin, Tennessee, or Athens, Georgia, or wherever. And that really meant a lot to me. And then I interviewed the a chef, cookbook author in Oxford, Mississippi. Vishwesh Bhatt is his name. His family is originally from India. His father came to this country to be a professor at University of Kentucky. So Vish was in college when his father came, and they brought the family. And so he was educated here, and then he got his master's in Oxford at University of Mississippi. But anyway, he really brought that point home on how much university towns bring culture and life to areas, particularly in a state like Mississippi, where food traditions are pretty simple and stayed and seldom change. So that was something new for me.
Yeah.
And I think it's everywhere, really.
Of course, you are researching, you're having those conversations, you are seeing that obvious cultural influence. Were there pockets where there was more of that?
Oh, yeah, definitely in urban areas versus rural. And back to the people in the land. I mean, the more rural and isolated an area, geographically, people don't commute. They don't commute. They farm, or they stay in their area. And that's where traditions seldom change. Or look at it the other way, that's where traditions are preserved, particularly in the mountains of the South. You find that still making of sauerkraut, the making of your own apple cider vinegar, putting it, canning sorghum, making sorghum, boiling it down. These traditions, canning, community canning kitchens still exist in the mountains of Virginia, where people have for the last 50 years gone in to put up their produce to feed the family, to feed the town, to feed wherever. And that is still going on because of isolation and the rural nature of that area. So they are going to be less likely to be baking with matcha powder and tinting, the icing on their cupcakes. But they'll be more likely to still be making sourdough bread and salt rising bread, because that's the way it's always been done. To me, I find both approaches fascinating. Really, how people are influenced, but also how people are never influenced. That goes on across America. It goes on around the world. Turning a pie into a crostata, that's a city thing. Making a peach cobbler, that's a country thing. There are certain ways. And what I learned about that peach cobblers and how they've been made in cast iron skillets and in Dutch ovens, the use of a dark pan adds everything to fruit cobblers in the summertime, because it's a darker surface, the juices and the sugar and the fruit all boil down, and there's more flavor.
You had mentioned access earlier, and then how some, of course, like Appalachia has, there's these isolated regions. And I guess I'm wondering, as you're researching, as you're having conversations with people, are you like connecting dots about when things became more accessible over time, as people are sharing what was being made, what their
Right.
mom was making, the ingredients their mom might have used versus what they were using when they were learning? Were those things that were kind of gaps filled in?
Well, I think you do. You develop a timeline, and certainly in the 20th century, that the 1920s were generally okay in the beginning. Then there was the Depression. Well, that, let's say, post World War One. Then there was the Depression and World War Two, and that from really 1929 until 1955, 56. I mean, the South was in a phase of recovery. I mean, it was not anything like what England, went through, certainly after World War II. So half of the 20th century in the South was recovery. And it all had already been a region that had to go through Reconstruction after the Civil War. So a lot of the South story is recovery and moving on and change and migration and moving someplace else and people moving in. Those are always in my mind. I mean, when someone says that their mother uses oleo in her pound cake, well, I know that That's a World War II recipe. It came right out of the 1940s because that's all that was available then. I think that's especially true when you look at old fruitcake recipes, how people start using a lot of extracts because those were substitutes for ingredients and they added flavor and they were cheap. I look at that recipe and yes, to answer your question, it kind of fits in a time frame for me. I know where it's coming from. Whereas some of the old recipes we still make today, like a pound cake, I mean, and creme anglaise and pudding and homemade ice cream, a lot of those recipes are even older. And, they came about, in the 1800s, really. They were just well preserved. Butter, sugar, flour, eggs.
You have access and have quite an extensive knowledge of so many different recipes. You've probably heard of nearly every kind of dessert under the sun, right? But were there,
Hmm.
I think you mentioned that the cantaloupe, was it you said it was a pie?
That was a pie. That was definitely new for me. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a surprise. So were there any other desserts that maybe you went in looking for a recipe because it sounded like a traditional Southern dessert that should be included,
Mhm.
but that ultimately you landed on a more quote unquote lost recipe for?
Yeah, I think certainly the sliced sweet potato pie, that was new to me. That's an Alabama recipe. I mean, sweet potato pies I knew were like pumpkin pies, kind of a custardy, you mash the sweet potatoes and it goes in with eggs and sugar and everything. But this is where you layer the slices of sweet potatoes and then you pour cream and molasses over it. It's fabulous. It's really good. And then put like a top crust on. So that was really different. I would say there's a recipe out of North Carolina. It's a type of cobbler. It's called a sonker. Essentially, it's a cobbler. It has a lot of juice. And so the trick on that is that you don't have that much pastry so that absorbs all the juices from your cobbler. So just the way you construct it in the pan is essential. And then also you make this kind of a custard sauce to pour over it if you want to, and it's called dip. For lack of a
Oh,
more interesting, it's just called dip. And so if you go to certain like middle of North Carolina, middle upper, they believe it's a Scottish recipe. Sonker is a Scottish word. But if you are served sonker, it's probably whatever fruit is in season. Blackberries, blueberries, peaches. It's going to have a little custard sauce to the side that you can pour over the top. And we would just call that cobbler. In North Carolina, it's called sonker. So I thought that was really, really interesting. It's those little variables. There's some recipes in Arkansas that add, if you can believe it, a puree of tomatoes to a chocolate cake because that's tomato growing region of Arkansas. Yeah.
I'm going to have, this is going to drive me crazy all summer now, and I will have to find the recipe. But as you are saying that,
Hmm.
I, for fun, because I love to cook. I love to be in the kitchen. Like I told you, I love the story behind something. I
Hmm.
found a recipe, I think I own the book, where they were sticking tomato. I think it was almost the way we might add a sour cream for moisture.
Hmm.
And I was so baffled.
Wow, interesting. They add when they were adding tomato juice or tomatoes or
I will have to check it. I don't think that it was a whole tomato, but
uh-huh.
there was tomato something in there and it was bizarre to me.
It's
And I will
crazy.
have to try and track that. That's my new summer goal, I guess. Is track that
Yeah.
recipe
Well, it's
down.
kind of it's definitely a retro thing. I mean, chocolate cakes have long been tampered with. I mean, people have added, especially old German recipes have sauerkraut in them or they have mashed potatoes. So it's just I think it's kind of fun to see what people will put in a beets, will put in a chocolate cake. And also if it's an old German recipe, I mean, they were very frugal and they also wrote everything down. So a lot of the old German recipes are our recipe of record because it's all we've got. And I think they were all farmers and they didn't waste anything. So if you think about
Yeah.
it from that perspective, then there also was that kind of retro recipe. It was the tomato soup spice cake that kind of came out in the I don't know. I think that was probably a 1930s recipe where you used a can of cream of tomato soup in a spice cake recipe. Yeah.
Interesting.
And it's pretty crazy. But if you've got enough cinnamon and everything in there, it's just a sort of a liquid. It's a vehicle.
Not the
It's not
flavor.
overpowering. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I'll have to track that down and I'll start, I have my grandmother. So I'm Philadelphia suburbs, not terribly
Hmm.
far from Amish country.
Oh, very nice.
And so there is a lot of German influence out here. And my grandmother, I was passed down one of her cookbooks, which is, I think, technically a Mennonite, some kind of cookbook
Uh-huh.
that she had over
Yeah.
the years and stuck all her own little notes in. So I'll have to start there. Maybe I saw it in there.
Look in there. You're going to see, first of all, look and see if you see chocolate, because chocolate, if it made its way to the South, it came with the Germans or the Jews. And
Hmm.
that's how chocolate, because chocolate was not an ingredient that was local at all. At the time, the chocolate was made in Europe. Europeans were accustomed to chocolate, but the English were not. And it wasn't, if you look into sort of the coffee houses, the chocolate houses, liquid drinking chocolate, that was all up east. That was not in the farmlands of the South. So when I see a chocolate cake in the South, that really stands out to me, and I want to know about that cake and where it came from and who brought the chocolate. So that's interesting. And then also the other popovers. There are a lot of breads that we kind of fell in love with in the South that are really native to your area of the country, popovers in particular. Yeah.
We do love our carbs up here.
We like them down here too.
We're big carb people.
Yeah, we are too.
Well, I will certainly check. I'll keep you posted if I find it. One of the things I just want to make sure I ask you about is kind of going back to your nostalgia, your
Hmm.
memories. Are
Hmm.
there any lost or older recipes? I don't like to use the term lost recipe, but
Hmm.
hopefully that makes sense that you are particularly fond of or that make you just scream summer to you.
Scream summer. I would definitely homemade ice cream. I think that we there's just so much ice cream commercially available now that nobody feels the need to make homemade ice cream. But it is so good. But it's also tricky using fresh fruit. The last few times I've made peach ice cream, I have found, and actually I wrote a piece for Southern Living about it, and it's in the June issue. But
I just saw it yesterday.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
but I learned that if you cook the peaches down a little bit, it makes sense. Using an iron skillet, you develop a lot more flavor, and then add them to the ice cream. So to try to condense those flavors first before you add to your ice cream custard mixture. What else? I think a good cobbler. I mean that but you always need enough people for that. I think that's always the problem with cobbler. You need more than two people to be present. My mother made a lot of angel food cakes, which I know are very much from your area of the
Mhm.
country. But
Very
that was
popular
what
here.
she would bake, an angel food cake in the summertime and fill the center with ice cream. Was it vanilla or raspberry ice cream or whatever? Or she'd be completely decadent and just make a caramel sauce and just pour it over the whole top of the angel food cake. That's super retro. You do not see that anymore at all. Well, she used to also, I mean, back to ice cream. We used to take ice cream balls and roll them in things. We would toast pecans and roll a vanilla ice cream ball into chopped, toasted pecans and put them back in the freezer. And then you make a homemade chocolate sauce and it goes over them. And you can do the same thing with coconut. We call those snowballs.
Okay.
Um, yeah, there was a lot of creativity. That was probably recipes from the 50s and 60s. Yeah,
Yeah.
love those.
I'll have to try the angel because we do have, that's really big. I mean, angel food cake around here is this time of the year in every grocery store, every bakery. And up here, which I think in the South, it's more a pound cake that you would use,
Hmm.
but for a
Hmm.
shortcake, a strawberry shortcake, we use angel food cake most of the time here.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I'll tip. It depends on where you're from in the South. Some people will use what we call a hot milk sponge cake, which is just a baking powder cake. Very simple. One, two, three, four. But most people will use biscuits. They might put biscuit dough. They might put a little bit of sugar in the biscuit dough, And then they might sort of brush with an egg wash and sugar on top before they go into the oven. But those are split, buttered, filled with sweetened strawberries. Put the lid back on and then pile whipped cream on top. So strawberry shortcake.
Yeah.
Biscuit style. Yeah.
Oh,
Very
man.
good.
Oh,
It's
man.
a meal. Well, we would have it for dinner sometimes in strawberry season. Yeah.
Well, almost all your food groups.
That's right. That's right.
Now, one of the last things I wanted to give you an opportunity to do, of course, you've written so much, but
Mhm.
I'm going to make sure in our show notes to link to some of your more recent cookbooks for folks to check out and hopefully purchase because they're well worth it. Did you want to break down what folks could expect in some of those?
So you'll probably see a book online. It's called Skillet Love. And that was my deep dive. That was book before last. That was a deep dive into the cast iron skillet. And I do love that book. My son was home during that research. We perfected the steak. We perfected the trout, the salmon. And it was using what is it about a cast iron skillet that makes food more delicious? What is it? So I really kind of dove into that at the beginning of the book. What is it? What are the properties? Why is it the darkness? Is it the patina? How do I season a cast iron skillet and protect it so it becomes an heirloom, etc.? But a lot of great appetizers, the roasted cherry tomatoes that you just roast in cast iron until they get real jammy with herbs and garlic. And then that becomes a sauce for pasta, or it can be poured over like some soft cheese. It's really nice as an appetizer. And then I wrote a book called American Cake, which was sort of a journey through time, 100 great cakes in America. And that got me definitely into the history department because each cake had a story. And that was red velvet cake, coconut cake, the Robert Redford cake, Julia Child's favorite cake, the pound cake, the Martha Washington cake, whatever. And then the little companion book after that was called American Cookie. And the same thing, I looked at 100 cookie recipes in the country and learned that, peanut butter cookies came out of the school lunch program, that oatmeal cookies are the cookie of the Depression. It's fascinating, really. And that also touched on a lot of the cultures that have come into the U.S. through immigration, Scandinavians, the Germans, that brought cookie baking with them to our country. And now they're just like a part of what we bake, the gingerbread cookies, Mexican wedding cookies, on and on. So yeah, I love those books.
Well, I will, like I said, make sure to share all the links that people may need in the show notes, both for purchasing books, but also for following along. You have, like you mentioned, a great, I think Substack is your newsletter
Yeah, that'd be great.
platform.
Yeah. Between
Yeah.
the layers.
Yep. So we can link to that. I know you're on
That's good.
social media, your website, all the things. We'll make sure folks have access to it in the show notes so it's all in one place. But Anne, just thank you so much for taking it. I could have asked a million more questions. This is such a fascinating subject matter. So thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, thank you, Allie, for all your great questions, and much luck on the rest of your pregnancy.
Thank you.
And good health, and hope you get through this summer nice and cool.
That is my top goal.